Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little here for PokerNews.com, and today we have another fun hand from the $10,000 buy-in six-handed tournament that I made a deep run in at the World Series of Poker. And here we get Ace-King of Clubs. That's a pretty nice hand in the cutoff, or the hijack seat. I'm definitely going to open this to about 1100, playing 100 big blinds deep. When you are playing a little bit deeper stack than most tournaments, you typically want to use slightly bigger bet sizes because you want to be able to play a big pot whenever you get a big hand. And, you know, sure enough, we have a big hand, so we definitely want to play a big pot. I make it 1100. A tight aggressive player in the cutoff now makes it 3300, and it's back onto me. So, in general, you want to make sure that you do have a 4-betting range. If you never have a 4-betting range, well, that just allows people to 3-bet you as much as they want because they don't have to fear you blowing them off their equity. And pretty much always you want to 4-bet the best hands, aces, kings, queens, and ace-king, and some bluffs. Depending on your range, maybe it's stuff like ace-9 offsuit, maybe it's ace-10 offsuit, maybe it's 8-5 suited, maybe it's 9-7 suited, maybe it's ace-5 suited. It depends on the scenario, and it depends on what you think about your opponent's range. Typically, I like 3-betting the bottom of my continuing range. So, like, say I want to call with ace-jack in this spot. That means I want to be 3-betting ace-10 offsuits. So, that's a reason to 4-bet, and I think in general I would prefer a 4-bet. Given my opponent is on the tight side, that's going to make me less inclined to 4-bet with much of anything because I don't expect to get 3-bet very much, so I don't need to be so worried about blowing my opponent off their equity. And if my opponent's an extremely tight player, I'm not going to 4-bet anything besides probably aces because my opponent's 3-betting range may just be only nut hands, like, well, aces. So there are times where I'm going to call this, times where I'm going to 3-bet it or 4-bet it, but usually I'm going to lean towards 4-betting to about 10,500 or so. You want to make sure you don't make it 7,000 or something like that because then you're giving your opponent great odds. But this time I do decide to call. Probably my opponent was slightly tighter than normal. So flop comes Jack-9-2, two clubs. Whenever the times you want to lead, or at least consider leading, are when the board should be great for your range and bad for your opponent. So right here, is this board so coordinated to the point that my opponent will not want to bet with stuff like aces, kings, queens, ace-jack? And the answer is probably not, right? If the board was instead 10-9-7, two clubs, that probably becomes a spot where I want to lead with some of my nut hands. This is not a nut hand, this is just a nut draw. And I want to lead with some of my draws that don't have a lot of showdown value. This one, however, does. Notice ace-king beats ace-queen, ace-10, ace-x. Right? It also beats king-queen, beats king-10, beats queen-10. It beats all these hands that may feel like 3-betting pre-flop. Now, I did say my opponent's a tight player and probably tighter than normal given I just flatted ace-king pre-flop. But people still 3-bet ace or ace-10 offsuit and ace-10 suited sometimes and queen-10 offsuit. They do it sometimes. They just do it. Even if you think your opponent is tight, they will randomly get out of line, especially if you have been on the aggressive side. So anyway, this is a spot where I'm definitely going to check with what I am playing more so as a marginal made hand than a draw. It's very, very difficult to know in scenarios like this. Is your hand more of a marginal made hand or a draw? If I had ace-4 suited, I would definitely be playing it more like a draw. And I would be raising now once my opponent bets the flop. But with ace-king, given I do beat all the other unpaired hands, I think we can very easily check call. Notice if I raise and my opponent jams, I have to call it off. So that would be a bit unfortunate. Because in the small pot, I'm probably, 50%, 55% equity. But if we play for all the money, I'm probably closer to 45% equity. And I would much rather have 55% in the small pot than 45% for all my money, right? So I definitely like calling here. But if my draw was weaker, I would raise. Turns of 3. We're again going to check. No point in leading here. Whenever the turn's a complete blank, it does not help anyone, which means whoever had the range advantage on the flop still has the range advantage, which is going to be our opponent. We check. He bets again. 3,800. Same story as on the flop. If I raise here and get called, I'm not loving it. Now I'm loving it way less because there's only one more card to come, right? If I am going to raise, I'm probably going to jam all in. And I would jam all in here with slow-played pocket jacks, slow-played pocket nines, slow-played pocket twos, which I'll have sometimes. I'd probably check raise Jack-9 suited on the flop if I had that. And that's about it. Really, I'm just jamming a few, not very many hands at this point because most of my draws do get raised on the flop. But in reality, do I want to play a big pot with a hand that's going to be well behind when I do get called. And the next question is, can my opponent actually call me very often, which I do think he can. Now, he did use a small bet size, so I don't think the opponent has a set at this point, but I do think he may still have queens, ace-jack, king-jack, maybe kings, maybe aces. Of course, he could also have a thinner value bet with a hand like pocket tens or ace-9, but I think more often than not, we are going to be shown either some weird bluff like king-queen, or just a pretty strong made hand. And I don't want to raise when I'm well behind, when I'm likely against a pretty strong made hand. So I call. River's a jack. And now, should we ever lead? This is an interesting spot. If I am going to lead, I want to ask, first, how many draws are in my range that I would like to bluff with? And well, I just told you I'm check raising most of them on the flop, or the turn. And that means my draws here are going to be ace-queen of clubs, ace-king of clubs, maybe ace-10 of clubs. And that's about it, right? Because I'm raising all the other ones. So I only have 3 bluff combinations. In this scenario, if I did lead, I would like to lead very big to try to have maximum fold equity against a hand like queens or tens or ace-jack. Well, not ace-jack, sorry. Ace-jack's not folding. Or, basically those one pair type hands. I say one pair. The board the pair on the board does not count. Don't think that, he has 2 pair. He has jacks and queens. Everyone has jacks. It's irrelevant. So the first thing you want to ask is, will my opponent actually fold a hand like queens if I jam all in? And they may. I'm not exactly sure. Notice we would be jamming for 1.5 times pot. If we're trying to be balanced in this scenario, the way you figure out how you want to structure your range is you want to have X percentage of bluffs in your range, where X is whatever the pot odds your opponent is getting to call. So say in this scenario, I jam all in, right? I'm betting 30 into 20, which means my opponent has to call 30 into a pot of 80, right? That means that 3 times out of 8, I need to be bluffing, and 5 times out of 8, I need to be value betting. Just thinking about that, I just told you I only have 3 bluffs in my range, ace, king, ace, queen, and ace 10 of clubs. That means I can have those 3 hands, and then 5 combinations of nut hands. So what are the obvious nut hands I'd like to jam with? Well, ace-jack makes a lot of sense, right? And there are probably the full 8 combinations of those. So right there, if I just jam with some of my ace-jacks and those 3 bluffs, we're going to be nicely balanced with that jamming strategy, and it's going to allow me to jam these hands and get some folds some portion of the time. Now, again, if your opponent's just going to snap call you a queens, no problem, that's probably a bad strategy. It is also worth noting the opponent could just have a jack, and given he did bet relatively small on the flop and the turn, kind of makes me think he could have a jack. So I don't necessarily think this is the right spot to go for this. This would be a little bit different if the opponent bet big on the flop and the turn, because then he's going to be way more weighted towards premium hands, but notice there are fewer of those now because the jack came on the river, because now there are fewer pocket jacks available, and that would make him more weighted probably towards the good overpairs. And if he has a good overpair, then he likely may fold it if I rip it in. But here I think he has a lot of jacks, so I'm not going to do that. So we're going to check. And the opponent checks behind. So I guess the other thing worth mentioning is, can ace-king win at the showdown? And probably not a lot. However, it is important to note here that the opponent should not be bluffing with all of his potential bluffs here, especially if he has king-queen, king-10, queen-10, and maybe 10-8. If he bluffs with all of those, he's going to be bluffing way too much. And notice, I could just have some jacks here. I could have king-jack, queen-jack, and jack-10, especially, all the suited ones. And if he decides to run an overly optimistic bluff in this scenario, if he bluffs too much, we're going to be able to call him fairly often, especially given the way this hand is played out, because a lot of my marginal made hands just turned into good made hands. And so for that reason, he can't bluff too often, which means this ace-king high actually does have a decent amount of showdown value, because I beat a lot of those draws that are going to decide to give up. So, did he decide to give up? No. This time he has pocket aces. So, we lost this hand. Would he have folded to a jam on the river? I don't know. Should he fold to a jam on the river? Well, think about this, right? Given the opponent has ace of diamonds, ace of spades, he does not block my flush draws, my potential bluffing flush draws, a lot of those which contain ace of clubs, which means I have all of those, and he blocks ace-jack, which means I am less likely to have ace-jack and more likely to have a bluff, which means that with this exact hand, ace of diamonds, ace of spades, he has a very easy call if I use that strategy I mentioned earlier of jamming these 3 bluffs and a few ace jacks, because he does not block ace jack and he blocks my bluff. So he has a great bluff catcher here. Do not fold against good players in this spot with this hand. What if he had a hand like queens with no queen of clubs? That becomes a lot closer. But even then, he still blocks ace queen, so there's one fewer. I'm sorry, if he has queens with the queen of clubs, he should almost certainly fold, because then he does not block ace jack and he blocks one of the bluffs, right? So you see how the blockers are very, very relevant there. Notice if I 4-bet this hand pre-flop, I would have gone broke. If I check raise the flop with this hand, I would have gone broke. If I check raise the turn with this hand, I would have gone broke. If I led this hand on the river, I would have gone broke. So in some way, we played this hand about as well as we could. Obviously, that's not a good way to analyze poker because you don't know exactly what your opponent has. But if you often find in scenarios like this, your opponent ends up getting stacked when they're in your shoes, but you stack them when you're in your own shoes, or you don't go broke in this scenario, like we did not go broke here. That's usually a good thing. And I think in tournaments, you typically do want to shy towards a lower variance approach, especially when you're out of position and when you expect to be against a strong range. That's your least powerful spot at the table, right? Out of position against a strong range, you need to be very cautious. It's very different if we are in position with a range advantage, then we can just blast off all we want. But this is a weak spot for us, and we need to make sure we don't lose all of our money. And fortunately, I didn't lose all my money this time, so we get to continue on in this $10,000 tournament. So next week, we'll keep going through these hands. Hope you enjoyed them. If you have any questions, please let me know on Twitter at Jonathan Little. I'm more than happy to help you there. And yeah, good luck in your games. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you next week.